Hi, Mzansi. You are listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food for Mzansi. My name is Patricia Tembo, your host, and welcome to episode 545. We will be looking at seed technology today, so you already know that this episode is going to be both informative and practical as we welcome Dr. Godfrey Kgatle, who is a plant pathologist, and he will be unpacking the role of hybrids, GMOs, and new breeding technologies, the role that they play in improving yield, as well as resistance to pests and diseases, climate resilience, and ultimately why it is important for farmers to have choices when it comes to selecting seed. Dr. Godfrey Kgatle, welcome to Farmers Inside Track. We are so excited to have you on today's episode. So welcome.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you for inviting me for this conversation. I'm always happy to sharing some of the work we do at Grain SA with our wider farming community as well as citizens and the rest of the global community. So thank you for the opportunity once again.
So Dr. Kgatle, you wear many hats, qualifications, recently adding a new one to you, but you are currently the research coordinator at Grain SA, as well as a postdoctoral plant pathologist. So for our listeners who may have not heard of you, because I'm pretty sure, some of our listeners have kind of seen your face at conferences, events, etc. For those who don't know what you do, maybe just give us a brief background of, the work you're doing in the sector.
I am a research coordinator at Grain SA. My official qualification is in a science called plant pathology. I always say humans get sick, they go to a doctor. Animals get sick, they go to a vet. When plants get sick, we are the guys that jump in and ensure that plants remain healthy and of high quality. What does that actually mean in terms of plant pathology? If one apple in your fridge is rotten, you might just throw it out. But if an entire consignment of apples are rotten, this can account millions of rands and dollars of losses. And this is where plant pathologists come in, where we try to understand the cause of the disease, what pathogen caused it, what conditions allow for it to thrive, and how do we then, through understanding its epidemiology, start curbing its impact on the losses. So we manage plant diseases. But my current role outside plant pathology is I'm a research coordinator, as you rightfully call it, a research coordinator at Grain SA. What that means is Grain SA is a farmers organization. It was created by farmers for farmers. Well, the idea behind Grain SA is to provide farmers with information that allow them or that enable them to be sustainable and profitable in their production. So we give them information in terms of economics. We have a farmer development wing. The research coordination role that I play falls under the research department, where we look at various potential issues ranging from climate to plant pathology or plant health to breeding to agronomy, and the list goes on. My role as a research coordinator, I'm a South African, so I'm a soccer fan. We call ourselves the middle field. We run to the farmers, hear what issues they are experiencing. They give us the issues. We try to understand what the issue is. As research coordinators, we try to develop a concept that we then take to researchers, various institutions, University of Pretoria, Stellenbosch, Limpopo, Vanda, ARC, and they help us do the research for that issue that the farmer would have had. And once the researchers have solutions or answers, and then we start, you would have seen in my different platforms, we start communicating the outputs and research informations and different platforms to various communities, farming communities, people, citizens, government, and so forth. So that's what research coordination at Grain South Africa actually entails. We are pretty much the middle field, trying to ensure that farmers are profitable and sustainable in their production.
Awesome. No, I love that. You are definitely hands-on when it comes to the issues that farmers have. So looking forward to all your insights to this conversation. I think getting right into it, we're looking at new seed technology, of course. Crop starts somewhere, and that is with the seed. Looking at our topic, we're going to be speaking about new breeding techniques and what that means for a farmer. Maybe if you could just set the context of what seed technology is, what new breeding techniques. We're going to use the term NBTs, I'm pretty sure, for our listeners, just so you don't fall away when you hear Dr. Godfrey say NBTs. So yes, maybe if you could just set the context of what they are and why farmers need to concern themselves with this.
Before we talk about version 5.5 of something, we need to know what version 1 of that thing was and why it's important for those in between developments and improvements of that thing until today, so that it can serve the people of today. So to answer the question of NBTs, or new breeding techniques, as you call it, we have to go all the way back to where crops come from. In African context, we talk about sorghum. That's the one that people generally say, this is our crop that our forefathers planted or grew. But in global context, we talk about maize as a main source of field crop, source of energy, source of starch. Maize is a wild plant, believe it or not. Its ancestor in its early days, when it was first discovered in Mexico, it looked more or less like a wheat plant or a barley plant. That was a wild type of maize. And over the years, through breeding, a simple crossing of certain genetics within the maize family, we've had a point where a maize became a commercial crop, where you could actually see a big cob or a big maize ear grow from a maize plant compared to its wild type. That's what we call domestication. Taking it from a wild plant and breeding it and crossing it with different lines to a point where you can actually grow it commercially. An entire community can be fed from 1 hectare's worth of maize. That's a journey that's come from about 7,000 years ago. And in South African context, about the 1600s, we've seen the introduction of maize in the country. This is where people have a tendency of saying colonizers introduced maize, which then took away sorghum. That is absolutely not the case. What we have seen with maize is amount of research that has been put into maize. So from breeding a cob into hybrids, into GMOs, and in 2025, what we're advocating for is actually breeding using a different technique altogether, which is the new breeding technique. In South African context, the first records of commercial production run about the 1920s. And because of breeding, we've seen maize grow per hectare from 0.6 tons, about 600 kilograms of maize produced on a hectare. A hectare around about the size of a soccer field or a rugby field is another soccer analogy. Up till a point where in 2025, the average national yield per hectare is 6 tons. So maize has grown from 0.6 to 6 tons, 10 times yields per hectare over the last 100 years. Can you imagine how long it's been? And some of the reasons for that is introduction of mechanization, introduction of fertilizers, introduction of hybrids, which is different from pollinated varieties. So introduction of hybrids, we've seen a 2 times jump in yield from 1.5 to around about 3 tons jump in yields. Introduction of GMOs, precision agriculture. This is where the last big jump that we've seen with the introduction of precision agriculture, where we've seen another 2 tons jump from 4 when GMOs were introduced. So just to contextualize where we are right now in terms of maize production, lots of research has come into place where we've seen a steady jump from 0.6 tons to 6 tons at the moment, a 10 times jump. And not as much research has been seen in our local indigenous crop like sorghum. And only now are we starting to see interest from our local breeders into how do we then also focus on the research on sorghum production so we can see the same yields development and increases in sorghum as well. And maybe we can touch on these ideas. One thing that I spoke about is hybrids. Maybe we can develop our conversation further into what hybrids are. Another thing I've spoken about that people generally are afraid of or engaging with is GMOs. And the next thing that we need to talk about is new breeding techniques. So from traditional breeding, we've seen hybrids, we've seen GMO get introduced, and new breeding techniques. So just in closing on this question, we've seen different forms of breeding, and all of that has allowed us to have this massive jump in yields. And if you speak to economists, a massive jump in yield speaks to a farmer being profitable. It speaks to the country being secure in terms of food security as well, and job security. All of that have ripple effects towards our agricultural landscape.
Thank you, Dr. Kgatle. You mentioned earlier that the visuals when it comes to just where the crop actually started and the progression of it. By the time this podcast is out, there will be an article from this podcast that whoever's listening can actually go look on Food for Mzansi's website. And we'll also link the article that you've written as well for more depth into that. But going back to, mentioning the maize varieties, just to not lose anyone, make sure we all stick with you. If you could briefly explain the differences between the OPVs, the open pollinated varieties, the GMO crop, and the hybrid crop before we go into the new breeding technology.
The OPVs, open pollinated varieties. So in the 1920s, when we started doing our first records, those are the crops being used. So basically, you have different lines being inbred. A farmer can actually acquire the seeds and then plant. At the end of the season, the farmer is actually able to harvest the grain, keep a bit for himself, and then use the rest or sell it. That's the OPV. It allows for a farm-safe seeds. But I'm going to tell you the drawback of what that is just now. The drawback with that is it has a yield cap, and the opportunity of mechanization and fertilizer optimizations and all of that are sort of limited. So there's a absolute 2 tons to 4 ton yield cap. While you use the same amount of fuel, same amount of fertilizer, same amount of inputs, the return in investment is going to be far less, although you have a saving in your seed from a previous season. And then there was an introduction of hybrids. And what those did is they allowed for that yield cap to then reach what would have been a 2-ton yield cap. Then we would have seen a doubling in yield. So it's something a farmer has to then grapple with for themselves. Do I save my seeds and yield 2 tons? The suffix price at the moment is sitting between 3,500 to 4,000 rand per ton. Or do I buy a new batch of seeds every year, but then I double my income? And this is where the argument that happens within communities, that people were forced to use hybrid seeds by different communities, and there was no force in this argument. It was a matter of farmer's choice. That's what we in South Africa are fortunate to have. We have organizations that ensure that we have the highest quality seeds, that farmers get supported with organizations like Sanso that really support farming communities in that instance. OPVs, a yield cap, hybrid seeds came in and was able to bridge that yield cap. And then the next question that you speak about is then genetically modified organisms, the GMOs. Just to keep the conversation simple here, GMOs have then come in and really supported farmers in various ways. First of all is disease management. If you think about fall armyworm that came in 2017, that almost wiped out an entire crop, especially on the northern parts of the country. Us having BT maize means that farmers can actually be protected by insertion of a foreign gene into a maize product. What I mean by that, a bacillus, a bacterial gene, gets inserted into a maize crop. It's all saved. It's all tested. During the growing phase of the plant, the gene gets activated and it protects the plant. Only during that phase, the gene gets activated and protects the plant from insects. So genetically modified can protect from insects, from pests and diseases. It also enables crops to actually, during drought periods, be able to be protected as well. So it can have some sort of tolerance to drought. We've seen in 2016, once again, where we had that massive drought in the country, where we could not produce enough food for our people. Having these technologies then enable our farmers to continue producing and serving our country with enough food. What does GM then actually mean? It means that plants can grow and give us higher yields. They can actually be protected from pests and diseases. This entails that there's less usage of chemicals, meaning that farmers actually are able to save a bit on their costs, as well as less chemicals are used. And it actually also means that even during adverse periods when the climate is not optimal for production, the GMO crops can actually continue being produced. So yield protection and climate resilience, that's what GMO actually then gives us. In terms of GMOs, if we're going to make then a comparison, let's move it one step further, I guess, to the question of NBTs. The NBTs, when they come in comparison to traditional breeding, then you get your hybrids and then you have your GMOs and the NBTs. NBTs actually then, because science has become so advanced, if you look at the automobile industry, we've come to a place where I can actually just now sit in a car overseas and get driven around by a vehicle. That's how far science is in the automobile industry. If you look at medicine, when we talk about the use of 5G or the 4IR, that a specialist can be on the other side of the world and operate on somebody on this side of the world. without actually him being there. That's advances in science. And we are also privileged in the name of science in agriculture, that sciences can advance agriculture now in terms of breeding, where the traditional breeding, the cost of breeding one cultivar, this is the drawback, goes into the billions. In terms of dollars, maybe it's about 200 million to finally have that one cultivar in the market. It's an expensive exercise. And not only is it expensive, it takes so much time. It takes many years of crossing, testing in the field, it not working, and crossing again, testing in the field, it not working, until a point where you actually have a cultivar that you can commercialize and have people use it and trust that the farmers will not be inconvenienced by such a cultivar. So that's traditional breeding. New breeding techniques then comes in and says, science is so far advanced, we understand the genetics of a maize plant or of a sorghum plant or of a tomato. So we are going to look at the genetics of a maize plant and look at the characteristics based on the genetics that we are interested in. If it's yield, we already know what the markers look like. If it's drought tolerance, we already know what it is. And we can actually just genetically manipulate the plant so that it can give us those traits. It doesn't become something that no longer takes 20 years, but it's something that can be done at a far quicker period. So when we start having frequent droughts, new breeding techniques can actually come in and help us develop, because we can already see the genetics, help us develop a crop that can be adaptable fast enough. When a new disease comes in, we had Goss's wilt come in and really cause much damage to our farmers' fields in the past season. New breeding techniques can actually, instead of waiting 10, 15 years to develop a cultivar that can be resistant, that can enable the breeders to quickly develop a crop that can be resilient once again, or resistant to or tolerant to a disease. The catch here is it's much quicker compared to the traditional breeding. And the results, we know not looking for a needle in a haystack. Because we have the profile of the crop, we can quickly find those markers that we're looking for and improve that crop into that crop of interest. All of these are guided under policies, by the way. It's not a naughty scientist that you see in movies come in and manipulate the policies and guidelines across the world on how these things can work and be managed. So there's a lot of regulations and support behind it. So in terms of those four, you can already see their drawbacks. The yield cap, GMOs allows then for even better adaptation. NBTs, one thing that I'm forgetting to say, NBTs, the breeding using NBTs is similar to that of using traditional methods. So there's no insertion of foreign material into the crop. It's pretty much still the same as traditional, but because we understand the genetic profile of the crop, we're able to, at a faster pace, breed for newer, adaptable crops that farmers can actually use. And once again, this is such an important topic. The sooner we are able to adapt to diseases and climate, the better we are able to continue producing to our national demand. And you'd have seen on the graph that I showed you that the national demand is such a critical thing. We are expected to have a 75 million population in the next 15 years on the same land, which is really getting a lot of trouble when we look at this. Our farmers this year alone not able to plant on time because of the heavy rains that we're experiencing. So we need technology to now step up and help farmers plant for our people, our population, so that we continue having enough food on our plate as a country.
I think you broke that down really well. Just to make sure that I'm following as well in this conversation. So new breeding technologies, the basis is already there. So you're not starting from scratch as you would with traditional breeding. And that's the whole point, to shorten the time it takes to develop a new variety so that it is put out into the market for farmers. So much sense. Okay, so for farmers now because there are a lot of farmers, of course, especially older generations that are concerned when it comes to new breeding technologies and GMOs, these words are, thrown around. I think it also comes from pressure from consumers. We've heard people say, no, I'm not going to eat GMO crops, etc. What do you have to say to farmers who are uncertain about new seed technologies and the development thereof?
To the farmers, when we talk about maize, I'll use maize as an example. We do national cultivar trials on an annual basis. In these trials, more than 150 cultivars get tested across the country on their adaptability to a particular place. So this is the privilege that I talk about. And within these tested cultivars, farmers are given options, a wide range of options. That's a privilege that South Africa sits on, a wide range of options in terms of access to seeds. There are countries that, I'm not going to mention names, are on their knees and brinks of food insecurity because of their lack of access to seeds.
True.
Not only do we have access to seeds, we have access to a wide range of seeds, and these seeds get tested for different climatic or regional adaptability or excellence. So to a farmer, that is a big win for us. So it enables us to have choice, and depending on your production system, that choice is absolutely what you can use. Please look out for the Grain SA magazine. We release the outputs of the national cultivar trials for different crops. Go look at your region and see which one are best suited and which you are most comfortable to use. But the importance of that, access to such a wide range, once again, I've spoken about choice. The second thing is your system, your profitability, which is key. If you're a farmer and you cannot be profitable in your production, I can't imagine you will be able to continue planting for long, because then farming is such an expensive exercise. And obviously access to the likes of, once again, the hybrids, the OPVs and your GMOs. We don't have the new breeding techniques at the moment. That's still fine. You're still self-sufficient as a country. All of these are properly regulated. We have a really strong government that has strong policies, and that's why it's taking a while for us to introduce the NBTs. And these policies allow us to protect you as a farmer, to protect the seed companies, to protect the communities as well. Before these get released, they get put through stringent trials and tests. What I'm saying is you can rest assured as a farmer that by the time a cultivar sits on your shelf or shop shelf, that it's gone through various rigorous testing and regulatory standards. I'm going to shift a bit where there seems to be an issue. There are also regulations that protect you as a farmer, that you can actually put your hand up and say, I've bought these seeds, they were not of good quality. And obviously, if you have enough evidence to show that the seeds were of not good quality and it's the seeds rather than your practice, you will reimburse accordingly. So what I'm saying is we have options and we have policies and regulations that protect you as a farmer and the seed companies themselves as well. And that's the privileged position we sit in South Africa. And to the citizen, the same applies. The reason we've been able to self-sufficiently self-supply as well as export is because, once again, our technologies are in place and we are able to produce enough. And there are policies, once again, to ensure that the food that gets to market is really safe for the consumers. Many tests have been done on these, and the consumer can be assured that they are eating or they have access to healthy and quality produce. And the government has standards to ensure that that is the case and the consumer is not prejudiced on that matter. So the fact that science is able to help us attain these quality produce, I almost guarantee you, please rest assured that we are in a good position as a country to be able to be self-sufficient as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Kgatle. You touched on it in the first question, but how improved seed genetics actually improve farmer yields and income. And, especially for farmers, as we mentioned, there are farmers who are still relying on traditional seeds, on OPVs as well. For those farmers, when we speak about yield and income, maybe if you can just break it down, practically, and how adopting the new improved seed genetics or new breeding technologies, when that is, available to them, why would they why to consider it?
I'm going to make a brief sum, a mathematical or economic sum. Last year, when we did the cost of production per hectare, a farmer spends on average, depending on the region that they're planting, ranges between 19,000 to about 27,000 per hectare. That's a range per hectare on dry land. It gets a lot more under irrigation. Let's say you are spending 19,000. It includes fertilizers, all your inputs, seeds, crop protection, mechanization, and then you use OPVs and your yield cap is 4 tons on a SAFEX price of 4,500, which is a lot more than it actually is during harvest season, almost 1,000 Rand more. My sum tells me this is about 18,000 Rand that the farmer actually gets back. That's 1,000 Rand less than the cost. I guess for our smallholder farming communities in most cases are fortunate enough that they are subsidized, but it means that somebody else is still paying for that cost per hectare. And in any case, so even if you are 50% subsidized, the most you can make is still far less than what it costs to plant. And when we start talking hybrids, by the way, the 4 tons, that's the upper 4 tons yields is the upper harvest or upper yields. But the national average for hybrids then sits at about 6 tons per hectare. So you are actually able to get something back in profits if your yield does meet the national average, if you use hybrids. And this is where I said earlier that choice, once again, goes back to the farming communities. That's why there's a shift into using hybrids over using OPVs, because there's an absolute economic gain for the farmer. So it's not a government choice or a multinational enforcement rule that says, but over and above that, it is still important. That's why your ARCs then become an important conversation in this. Because the downfall about this is we move into a national dependency of multinationals to supply us with seeds. And this is where my fear comes in. So when we have organizations like research councils like the ARC or the Department of Agriculture, we need to look on how do we promote local seed production and local seed banks so that in an event where there's a global crisis one day like we had with COVID, but one that's much bigger than COVID, will we be self-sufficient in our local seed production? And if the answer is yes, then there's absolutely no reason for us then to be concerned in whether we use seeds like hybrids where you have to, on an annual basis, make a purchase of seeds. To answer your question, hybrids make economic sense, but in a wider national focus, I become concerned that hybrids are sold by multinationals. If you look at it from a global crisis issue, if one day there's a global crisis, will we be able to have enough seed production? And if ARC and the likes of the DOA can answer that question, I will always say, as much as a farmer choice, it makes sense why a farmer would then go for hybrids over OPVs when it comes to maize production at this point.
And to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here, is there time then with, sitting from your position, working with farmers and within the research space itself, is there time for farmers then to completely let go of OPVs and traditional seeds?
I would never say let go. You remember, first thing I always spoke about is choice. We need to always have choice. If a farmer is comfortable based on their farming operation with OPVs, I full on encourage that. If their production ROI makes sense, you don't let one system go because the other system is better for a farmer elsewhere. So choice in capital letter must always stay. And I advocate for choice. Choice is always going to depend on the end user, who's the farmer at the end of the day.
It's also on the 2030, the National Development Agenda for Agriculture to be self-sufficient in seed production. So hopefully that is something that we will see going forward. Going into NBTs and how that, I suppose, makes it easier for farmers. You touched on it earlier, pests, weeds, climatic stresses, etc. Pests, as we know, and diseases, microorganisms are evolving as well with the weather. So I think there's always more continuous research and development of these seeds. So maybe speaking about NBTs now, how do technology address the issue of pests, diseases, climatic conditions, the changing climate that we're already experiencing now?
I'm going to answer it with a reference back to the part where I said, while GMOs, that insertion of a foreign gene that enables the plant to have resistance or tolerance to that particular disease, or an insertion of a foreign gene that enables the plant to be drought tolerant. Now all of a sudden, there's a gene from a foreign plant that was able to withstand very dry, hot conditions. And now the plants are able to be drought tolerant and climatic resilience. And that's the GMO part, or insert. So I spoke about disease, pests, I guess, or insert a gene that enables it to have better stands and bigger crop and yield more. That is what GMO gives you. The traditional breeding also gives you that. You can breed for resistance to certain diseases. However, going back to the point I made, the amount of effort and time and all of that has a cost implication as well. To eventually get to a point where you have that commercially viable crop. The traditional breeding just takes time. Whereas the NBTs, once again, through our understanding of science and genetics, you know exactly what markers within the genetics are responsible for whatever trait of that plant is. And being able to play around with those traits, if you want yield, then you can actually, you know what markers, and you play around with the yields. You play around with the disease, particular disease protection. I'm going to give another example. This year we had one of the highest levels of ear rots. So now you've gone on, you've planted your plants, they've looked healthy all year. And all of a sudden, towards the end of the season, your ears start rotting because of Fusarium or Diplodia. We can look at which parts of the plant's genetics enable it to bypass Diplodia or Fusarium ear rots, and then you get a healthy crop at the end of the season. So NBTs becomes a more direct, a more focused approach as compared to the traditional breeding. So by the time you are done breeding with NBTs, it would be the same as having used traditional breeding, but only now instead of testing tens and thousands of lines, you only test those that you are interested in because you know what their genetics look like.
I suppose the next thing to speak about in this conversation is, farmers now, how they can prepare themselves for new seed technologies. What does that look like? Does that mean, farmers, they've made the decision, for example, now to cross over from, depending on traditional seed or OPVs to hybrid seeds? What does that look like? Does one have to change the whole entire practice, cultivation practice? How would this look like for a farmer?
This is more of an agronomic question. And once again, to respond to this answer, I'm going to talk about one of the projects that we do at Grain SA, which is called a data intensive farming management project. So it uses a lot of data. So just to keep the answer simple, the return in investment is what is going to keep a farmer farming for the next 20 years so that his kids can take over his farm and continue farming. The moment you lose on profitability, that's when you actually start getting into trouble. So this data farming intensive management then says, we see the choice that you're going to make. If you're going to use this particular OPVs, you must understand what their planting population needs to be. You must understand what the planting population, the seeding rate needs to be. You need to understand what the fertilizer rate for that particular cultivar needs to be. And you need to understand what the environment in which you are planting that cultivar needs to be. Whether you are planting OPVs or hybrids or GMOs, understanding all of these traits will then speak to you eventually getting to a point where you don't overspend on fertilizer or overspend on seeds or overspend on chemicals, but you apply yourself enough so that when you harvest, your yields, the pricing you get from yields don't over exceeds that of the inputs. The yields exceeds that of the inputs. That you don't find yourself where the inputs would have cost more than what you're going to get from your yields. Once again, understanding those agronomic principles speak back to your choice. Once again, you can go for whatever choice. Just make sure that your inputs are far less than what you yield.
And I think we've covered everything we were set out to cover in this conversation. So if there's anything else that you'd like to add and that you think or is important, for a crop producer listening, please do so.
We are privileged in South Africa. We have research institutions like the ARC, universities. If you are a farmer and there's any question that you have, please do not be afraid to ask those questions. Get in touch with your local government institutions as well. Get in touch with Grain SA. Ask the questions. We are privileged in South Africa. Not only that we have research that's applied, enables us to have choices. In fact, before I even talk about choices, the seed supply. There are countries out there that do not have access to enough seeds to feed their nation. We have that seed supply. And not only do we have enough seed supply, we have seed supply that has lots of varieties that are most adaptable to different agroclimatical zones. So you have choice of seeds, choice of cultivars for your particular area. And then that's how we are able to be self-sufficient at the moment as a country. We've hit a record, I think, 17 million harvest in the past season, which is great news. We need to keep that up. By 2040, we need to increase to 17 million to 24 million if we're going to continue being food self-sufficient. So the next thing is farming is not an easy game, and we appreciate you farmers for what you do. And once again, that's why I speak about the support that is available for you that you need to really use so that you can get information and insight on what is going on. And the last thing after choice is I want our consumers to come on board and realize what it takes to be a farmer. I've given that expensive exercise. That's why we have so much land that is unused at the moment. Some of the reasons for that is because we do not have enough capital to tap into those lands. It's an expensive exercise. And allowing our farmers to use the best technologies to make us be globally competitive. And it also allows us to have food security. And not only does it allow us to have food security, if we talk about the amount of jobs that come in with that. In addition to that, all of these agricultural practices are absolutely well regulated. And that's why the conversation of NBTs in South African context, taking a step back, where the government really needs to understand what it actually entails. By the time they introduce it, they know that the consumer is protected, the farmer is protected, and everyone is protected. So we have the privilege of having robust policies that are really being supported and followed through. So all the way from your research to access to seeds, to access to diversity of cultivars, as well as policies, that's what's enabling us to produce to our demand. So it's a privilege to be South African. It's an honor to actually also be servicing the South African community in terms of agriculture. So thank you for that. I've touched on it, but I think it's important to touch on it. Why maize? Why not sorghum? Sorghum is healthier. Maize just simply is a global crop. Maize makes financial sense. And maize is not bad in terms of its nutrition either. Sorghum might be better, but maize is not bad. Maize has value chain systems that have been long existing. But in terms of sorghum, Grain SA is actually also working on, together with the Department of Science and Technology and Innovation, as well as TIA, Technology Innovation Agency, as well as a sorghum trust, or what we call sorghum cluster initiative. The question in this cluster is, how do we make sorghum an even more commercially viable crop with strong value chain presence? And how do we support the cluster to a point where farmers can actually grow it? But the catch is, you as a consumer need to be able to start testing out different recipes and enjoying it. Yeah. So we mustn't produce all of the sorghum and no one is willing to buy it. Again, there's no market for it. So there's a lot of work happening. Maize is just a globally recognized crop. Here's another point about farm-saved seeds and hybrids. If I show you the growth curve of maize production per hectare in the country since the 1920s, as I indicated, genetics played a big key. The thing about farm-safe seeds is a farmer can purchase, use it, harvest, and reuse. What benefit is that to a breeder? If I'm going to spend 200 million on creating such a cultivar, and then I'm only going to sell it once, I have no profit interest, no gain in that. And as a result, I'm not going to continue developing cultivars. As much as a farmer needs to purchase it on an annual basis, me as a seed company are able to get revenue back and get the spend that I put into creating that hybrid. I'm able to retrieve it back, and I can actually reinvest it into continued research and improving such a cultivar. And that's why in South African context, we've realized what that actually means. And that's the likes of SECTA, South African Cultivar Technology Agency. SECTA came in. And then it said, okay, for those OPV kind of crops where farmers can actually keep seeds, a really tiny levy will be charged to a farmer per ton. And this levy will actually then go back to the seed company that produced that cultivar. And that creates an incentive for the seed company to continue researching on that crop and breeding on it to improve the crop. The farmer can keep it, but after 10 years, you'll be using a seed that was produced 10 years ago. Whereas there could be other cultivars that are much better and a lot more improved. I know it almost sounds like I'm multinationals on that, but it's not the case. Because they are multinationals and they have a wider global market, their research arm and capacity is much bigger than our local. And that's why they almost outcompete our local seeding companies. But I still think as a nation, even if it's rather small steps compared to the big steps that multinational takers, we must not stop taking those small steps. we have to continue on a year-on-year basis, trying to work on our own local cultivars and trying to put gains on that. Because once again, I'm not being a pessimist, but we've seen with COVID, where there was a global lockdown, we don't want to find ourselves in the case where there's another global lockdown and we do not have access to seeds because you're heavily dependent on multinationals.
Thank you so much to Dr. Godfrey Kgatle, who is a plant pathologist. And if you'd like to know more about this topic, you can definitely visit www.foodformzansi.co.za. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on all your favorite platforms. From myself, Patricia Timbo, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #Team Food for Mzansi, thank you for listening and keep growing with us.